Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this month's installation of the UK Climate Projections webinar series. Really great to see so many of you here for a really interesting set of talks that we've got scheduled. I'll begin with just a bit of housekeeping. So if we'll go to the first slide, thanks Lali. Just as a reminder, or for those of you who haven't been to one of these before, each presentation will be followed by an opportunity for Q&A. Please do use the Q&A button at the top of your screens to pose questions, and that will allow you to upvote some of the questions that other people have asked as well, and we'll use that upvoting to select which questions to put to the speakers. In between our two speakers, we are going to ask you to just do a short survey to get some feedback on how you think these webinars are going. So if you could help us out with that, we'd really appreciate it. All attendees will remain muted. Us as organisers have the opportunity to enable you to speak, but please do use that Q&A feature to put your questions to the speakers. This webinar is being recorded, so I hope that's fine with everyone. The recording will be shared on the Met Office's YouTube channel, so you can pass that to those who've missed this to catch up on at another time. If you're having any technical difficulties, if you can use this email address, the UKCP user network at metoffice.gov.uk, or the chat function to raise our awareness, and we'll try and help you out with those while the webinar is in undergoing. And finally, we are always looking for speakers for these webinars. So if you have an example of the use of UKCP that you'd like to present in this forum, please do get in touch, and we'd love to hear from you at that same email address. So that's ukcp.usernetwork@metoffice.gov.uk. Okay. Coming up, we've got two really great speakers. I'll start by just introducing myself. I'm Carol McSweeney. I'm the UKCP Deputy Science Lead. So I've been at the Met Office for about 15 years. We've got two excellent speakers coming up. So we have Terena Plowright from the Greening Campaign CIC. Who's going to talk about the importance of communities, the need to engage the general public in debate and learning. And our second speaker will be Jonathan Tinker from the Met Office, talking about a new set of UKCP 18 aligned physical marine climate projections for the Northwest European shelf seas. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce Terena. I've got some background information to share with you. So Terena has been involved in environmental issues since the 1980s. She has a degree in politics, written a book, set up the award-winning South Downs Natural Burial Site, run the Sustainability Centre for 10 years, is a trained journalist with a history of working on BBC documentaries, and all this is mirrored in her love of the South Downs and her 30 rescue animals. Terena's focus since 2007 has been the Greening Campaign, which she is a founder and director. The Greening Campaign has worked with over 200 communities across Hampshire and beyond. Okay, over to you, Terena. You there, Terena?
I think she's on mute.
Ah, we can't hear you, Terena. Terena, can you just check whether you've unmuted yourself so we can hear?
My mute button disappeared, so sorry about that. Right, so it slid across off the front there. Right, so obviously my main focus is communities, and communities can be rather challenging in that they are, for obvious reasons, full of all different types of people. When we're talking to communities, which we have done since 2007, which is when we were formed, we're mainly talking about how do we engage those communities in mitigation. And we do that through 5 pillars that are listed in front of you. And we partner with expert organisations to make sure that they feel confident, the communities feel confident in taking action on any of these subjects. For us, it's really exciting at the moment because we're going to be adding adaptation to the process. And for the reasons I'll explain in a minute, we think it is really important to engage just the general public in the debate. So when we look at what are communities, there's lots of types of communities. We've got friends, we've got faith groups, we've got lots of types that mix together. But when we're talking about communities, we're talking about people that live in the same geographic area, such as village or a town or something like that. I think we who are in this kind of adaptation focused world don't tend to take the conversation into where we live for some reason. I shouldn't think it's a subject we bring up when we're in the pub with friends very often. And for some reason, we see it as kind of our professional life as opposed to with friends and family. Businesses, on the other hand, are way ahead of communities, I think. They're already planning, they're already have people, designated to look at it. And I struggle to understand why we're not doing that with communities. I think one thing we've got to be really careful with, though, when talking about adaptation is giving people in communities too much hope so that they don't mitigate. And so I think we need to be very careful how we balance the conversation. At the bottom there, I've said communities are powerful. And the reason I've said that is because actually we all are part of communities and we all have knowledge. So why do we need them to understand about adaptation? And really, if we don't, then the policymakers are going to be met constantly with blocks from the general public as to why certain actions need to be done. The other thing is people are really good at scrutinizing policy, and if they begin to understand what's going on, then they can begin to bring their different opinions and expertise to the questions. People living in geographical areas also know those areas in massive detail, and some of them have obviously lived there for generations and can remember certain physical things that have happened that may happen again with bigger impact in the future, and that can feed into the understanding. And also we absolutely have to get people to understand that their communities need to be resilient. When we're talking about climate change, one of the really big topics that's coming about at the moment is people are suffering from climate anxiety. And one of the key elements of well-being is having control. And I think if we can get people to understand the risks properly, as opposed to just feeding them quite big statements across the news, then and they begin to understand how they can adapt, then that gives them a level of control. And I think that will possibly help some of the problems we've got with climate anxiety. It obviously increases people's awareness for the reasons to mitigate, if they understand the impacts. And we feed them stuff from science, but I think if the people in their own communities have undertaken the research, then I think that information will be trusted more by the residents in that community. So when we're talking about where we are now, I think what we have to do is understand where the communities are now and what they actually understand by the meaning of the word adaptation. And I think people across communities will be at different levels. And I think we need to find a way to kind of communicate across all that different understanding. The community adaptation toolkit that we are looking at had a foundation in 2019 when we put together a kind of format, and we've been speaking to partners ever since then, really, looking at the basic process that we can move forward from with the communities, giving them the ability to look at their communities and understand the risks. There are loads of questions that come off the back of this, as you may well expect. I think one of the big problems we've got is whether the community will trust the process because it's so complex, especially when you're looking at stuff like, the data. So I think we're going to have a really big problem trying to get them to understand how that works. We also need to understand who in the community we want to be able to access the information. Does everybody need to understand it, or could there be those different levels? Could we just produce a one-page report from within the community? The other danger is obviously we don't want to overload communities. They are volunteers. So we've got to be careful about how much work we give them to do, within that. So to understand, to enable us to move forward, we are working on all of this, which is not the easiest thing to do. As I said, we need to understand the level of awareness they've already got and whether it differs from community to community. And what we've got to be careful of is things like whether deprived communities are likely to get left behind. And we know, as always, those in deprivation are likely to be the worst hit. So we need to understand how to communicate to people that perhaps haven't got access even to computers. How much detail, as I said, do they need? And how much do they need to know when they're making decisions about what their community is going to look like for the future? So it's about control again, so that they can make those decisions. How much can they cope with? And I guess, how localized do we need the research? So is it at parish level, district and sub-district? The methods to access the learning are those that I've listed below. So it's kind of a toolkit, obviously, but we also need the case studies so that they can learn from each other and visit existing projects for those that don't learn through internet or words. And then we look at the possible barriers. And I think the biggest barrier we're likely to have is people like certainty. And with climate change, we don't have certainty at all. And so it's about understanding projections, and that then brings in level of complexity. The lack of decision-making power. So that once we've given them the information, they only have certain levels of decision-making power to act on that information. And the design process, I think, for the training is going to be essential to sit by the UKCP 18 complexity. So we also need to bring in all of these kind of partners, and we are talking to some of them at the moment so that we can support the learning. But we also need not just the negative impacts, but we need to understand the positive as well. So that, because as you know, not everything is negative when it comes to a changing climate. And these are the potential partners that we're talking to right now. Some of them we've been talking to for a long time, such as Peter Walton. He has been amazing in helping us understand all of it, really. We're also talking to New Forest District Council and Hampshire County Council, who are looking to partner with us, as well as the New Forest National Park, so that we've got a kind of pilot area. But we're also extending our existing relationships too. So I guess what next is answer the questions that we've raised. We are talking to the lottery about funding for this, and we need to identify the various partners and roles. And my question, I guess, to this group is there anybody that you think would be essential to be part of this? Are you a potential partner that could bring support for communities? And I really genuinely welcome all feedback from everybody on the call. And that's that.
Thanks very much, Terena, for a really interesting talk. I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A box for any questions coming in. I can't see any yet. So maybe as I'll take the moderator's privilege and ask the first one. I'll ask a question that's close to my heart, Terena, which is really thinking about how you use the UKCP 18 information. And you mentioned the complexity, and I wondered whether there are particular products from UKCP 18 or ways of interpreting UKCP 18 that you've seen that are particularly helpful in your context, and that you and the groups involved have found it easier to understand and interpret.
Well, number one, I think my greatest tool for the communities will actually be Pete Walton, because he has the ability to communicate that information really easily. So that's I think the biggest tool that we're likely to use, because it's just going to be plain language. But off the back of that, they are going to have to look at some of the data. You used to have, and I'm talking about probably 15 years ago, and I haven't found it again. I can't find it in there. Some information about more local impacts and how to address that. Is that still in there somewhere?
You might be going back a little bit before my time, Terena, but we can perhaps talk. There are a few different routes, and maybe we can talk a bit offline about those. But yeah, there are some routes, but yeah, I'd like to understand what it was you were trying to get at more particularly.
Yeah, because I think that was quite useful, and it was more simple, but it seems to have disappeared. So one of the things, once we get a bit further down the line, I'd like to discuss about recreating that to a certain level. But yes, people do need to understand the basic data, where it comes from, so that because without that, they won't have confidence. So sure. I think it's really important, and I think that with Pete we will be able to design a process that will simplify their access to that, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the role of the human interpretation is always quite key there, as well as finding, offering tools and likewise. Yeah, it's almost indispensable, isn't it, that two-way dialogue that allows you to really communicate some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got one more question in the Q&A from Sitlali. So Sitlali says, thank you for the talk. Very true. I did want to know what scale the community is most interested in regarding climate.
Wow. So we've had villages with sort of 300 houses, all the way up to working at national park scale with the New Forest. But we ideally would work with groups that we're already working with, which are sort of between 300 to 10,000 households. So that would be our ideal scale, because it allows people to feel that they have a voice within it. When it gets too big, people feel that somebody else is dealing with it and they don't have a voice. And I think when you're dealing with communities, we need to make sure that everybody feels that they've got a say, regardless of education, regardless of finance, regardless of anything. Everybody has to feel empowered. So keeping it really small makes it more accessible.
Okay, the questions are snowballing now, so we'll try and squeeze a few of these in before our time is up. But I'm going to combine two of these. There are two questions around what is the kind of knowledge level within the communities you're talking to. So the first is around, from Benjamin Hext, do the communities even know about UKCP 18 before you start your work, or are they perhaps looking at more misleading info channels on climate change? And there's a further question about, have you found that town parish councils are interested and knowledgeable about adaptation, or is it still too big a topic for them at this stage?
Do you know what? Regarding UKCP 18, no, they haven't got a clue it's there. They're reading goodness knows what. And I think it's really important that we begin to communicate so that they're not just taking stuff off the shelf, off Facebook, off, whatever they're looking at, and they have some hard evidence to communicate with. I think that's really important. With regards to the parish and town councils, they're really struggling, and it's really difficult to get climate change at the front of their agenda. They understand the need to mitigate. A few understand the word adaptation. What behind that they understand is very, very, very limited. So I think the first thing we've got to do is find out the level of kind of consciousness around this subject, and then build as we go forward. So it's very similar to when we first started working in 2007. The big question I used to get was, what is climate change? Clearly, I don't get that question anymore. But people are now looking at more detail. So what we hope is that we will be able to take people on the same journey with regards to adaptation.
Thanks, Terena. Okay, I'll go to the next question. Tom Beach says, thanks for the presentation. Have you found that town... Oh no, we've done that one. I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh, Giles Diddle is the one I wanted to go to. Have you looked at community climate outreach efforts in other places? He points out that there's potential to learn from one another. For example, in Bristol, we have had Community Climate Action Hub, which is a link to if anybody wants a further look.
Yes, so we are talking to other people and people that are trying to do this sort of thing. And we know there's some quite big organizations that are looking at, I think, at more specific, tighter areas. So buildings, specifically looking at impacts on buildings, and flooding is obviously communities that have flooded are suddenly aware of the flooding impacts and they focus down on those. So if a community has had an impact, they become very knowledgeable about that. But I don't think people necessarily, or I haven't seen, I'd be grateful, really grateful if there's anything out there that kind of gets people to understand all the overlaps between all the impacts, rather than just focusing on one type. So I think it's really important that we understand that obviously nature recovery can really support flooding, but we kind of don't communicate it like that, I don't think. So there we go. It's challenges everywhere.
There are the whole myriad of challenges. Okay, thanks, Terena. So there's just one further comment, I think, in the question, which is from Susanna Lincoln at CFAS. He just wants to highlight some of the resonance between the Greening Campaign and the project they've got underway. So I think she'll be in touch with you separately.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's a really nice outcome. Okay, thanks ever so much, Terena. Thanks for that really interesting talk. And I think we'll move on to our next item. And now if we could just take a few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, to have a look at this webinar. It should only take a couple of minutes. So there's a QR code. I hope you'll be able to access that all right. But yeah, your feedback to help us just keep these webinars going and perhaps tweak the format if necessary would be really helpful. Okay, I think we'll come back into the room. Feel free to carry on with that with that survey while we resume our talks. I feel like we should have been playing some lift music or something while you were doing that. Anyway, thanks all for your patience, and I think we'll move on to our second speaker shortly. So I'll just give a short introduction and then I'll hand over to Jonathan. So welcome to Jonathan Tinker, who's been researching the Northwest European shelf seas at the Met Office for the past 15 years, most of which as a climate research scientist working on the marine climate projections that are part of UKCP 18. Jonathan now manages the Operation Shelf Seas forecasting team. So that's running the same shelf seas models operationally to produce 6-day forecasts of the wave physical and biogeochemical conditions of the Northwest Shelf. Okay, thanks ever so much, Jonathan. Over to you.
Great, thanks for the previous talk and thanks for the introduction. So the work I'm going to be talking about now is a new set of climate projections for the Northwest European Shelf Seas, and this work with other people. So I'd like to thank the co-authors here as well. So take control. Okay, here we go. Okay, so first I'll give a bit of a background and talk about the model, experimental design, the models and the data we've released, talk a little bit about the evaluation, the results, and then give some conclusions. So the UK obviously produces climate projections as part of UKCP. UKCP 09 was the first that had a dedicated marine report. And within this, there was a set of Northwest Shelf projections, so physical 3D temperature salinity. UKCP 09 was based on HAD-CM3, a perturbed parameter ensemble of this model. This was a good but a relatively old model at the time. And it was run as a perturbed parameter ensemble. The shelf seas component was an exploratory sort of thing. It was the first time it had been done, and there was only a single ensemble member, so no estimate of uncertainty, and there was time slices rather than transient experiments. The GCM HAD-CM3 was downscaled with POLCOMS, which was a 12-kilometer regional shelf seas model, and that was also quite old at the time. So we sort of see these as the first generation of Northwest Shelf marine climate projections. These were updated a few years later as part of the Minerva projections using the same methodology and same models, but rather than being a single ensemble member, all 11 ensemble members were downscaled and they were run as transient experiments. Again, data was released to the public. and we consider these to be second generation Northwest Shelf projections. UKCP 18 came along based on HADGEM3, which is the latest Hadley Centre model, so much advanced compared to HADCM3, again based on a perturbed parameter ensemble. There was a dedicated marine report again, but this time it had a sea level component, sea level focus, and there was no Northwest Shelf projections. There was a study on the present day variability of sea level on the Northwest Shelf, and this used the same 3D models we'll be talking about later, but only the sea surface height was analysed. So this led to a bit of inconsistency for the CCRA, the Climate Change Risk Assessment, where the atmosphere data evidence could be based on the latest UKCP 18, but the marine data would come from effectively UKCP 09. So we plan to release a set of projections based on the downscaling the UKCP 18 perturbed parameter ensemble, HADGEM3, using the latest shelf seas model, NEMO Shelf, version 4 CO9. This had wetting and drying, and we had to make quite a few changes to make it relevant for the climate projections. And the configuration has been released here on GitHub. So the methodology was to take the HADGEM3 perturbed parameter ensemble and downscale it with NEMO 4 on the AMM7 domain. So that's a 7-kilometer resolution for all 12 ensemble members. We plan to release a much larger data set than we had in the past and publish the results as part of an open source journal, which is given here. This was about the time that I changed jobs so I wasn't able to continue on with that beyond this. Okay, so the data was released as part of the CEDAR dataset, given the link given here. There was 3 components, as well as the 12 ensemble members. We released monthly 2D fields of all the ensemble members. We also produced regional mean time series of different regions on the Northwest Shelf and climatologies based on 2 main periods. These climatologies then fed into ensemble statistics, and we packaged this up with a present-day control simulation that was run for UKCP 18. So you had the estimate of the unforced variability as well as the transient climate change. All the post-processing code was available on GitHub here. So if you wanted to rerun it with different climatological periods, that's possible too. Okay, so evaluation of climate climate models is quite difficult because climate models, especially uninitialized ones like this, simulate the climate rather than the weather, and you need a long observation data set to be able to average out the weather to compare like for like. And in coastal shelf seas waters like the Northwest Shelf, these are relatively sparse compared to the scales of variability. So we looked at the tide with co-tidal charts down here as calculated from the model and compared to other models. The sea surface temperature was compared to the austere temperature analysis. Sea surface height was compared to tide gauges and satellite altimetry. Temperature, surface and bed temperature and salinity was compared to the quality controlled EN4 profile dataset. We compared to 11 ICES climate time series, sorry, these ones here, these are tide gauges. And we compared volume transport to a number of cross sections to observational estimates. Sea surface temperature was, here we compare the ensemble mean to austere for the annual mean and against different seasons. We found it highly correlated, and the annual mean Northwest Shelf bias less than ½ degree, and most of the shelf was less than about 0.7 degrees. The seasonal sea surface temperature was with the ensemble spread, but the summer was too warm and the spring was too cold up here. Hatching shows where it's outside the ensemble mean. Ensemble spread, sorry. EN4 data is a little bit more difficult to use because there's very few repeated observations through the years. So we took a slightly different approach by asking where the observations sat within the ensemble spread. So the ensemble mean minus the observation divided by the ensemble spread. We assigned each profile to the nearest grid box, and then, as well as looking at these spatial patterns, looked at regional statistics given here. So surface and bed temperature tended to be within the ensemble spread. Salinity had much greater spatial variability, but was also normally within the ensemble spread. So running through some of the other data sets, the tide gauges tend to be in fairly good agreement with the models. The altimetry sea surface height, so this is the mean sea surface height, agreed well with the satellite, and the variability was in quite good agreement too. The transport was qualitatively consistent with the observations, and the IC's time series were generally within, the absolute bias was generally within 1 degree and 0.2 of the salinity. So we'll look at some of the results. First of all, the residual circulation. So that's the mean currents after you average out the tides. There's a general reduction in the northwest shelf mean residual circulation, although the slope current tended to strengthen north of about 60 degrees and south of about 55 degrees north. There's a mechanism that Jason Holt noted where increased stratification increased the Rossby radius, which made it more difficult for the current to turn into the Norwegian Trench. So this tended to bypass the Norwegian Trench. We don't see the large-scale North and North Sea configuration change that was seen in the Minerva projections and also explained by Jason Holt. But we do see a slight configuration change down to the south and west of Ireland. When looking at the transport cross sections, we saw similar sort of things with a general weakening of circulation across the shelf, a weakening of the northern North Sea inflow of the Dooley currents, and the English Channel inflow and the Skagerrak recirculation. As well as looking at the mean residual circulation, we looked at the uncertainty around this using this new method of uncertainty ellipses. If you think of temperature being normally Gaussian distributed, it's quite easy to think of that in one dimension, whereas currents have 2 dimensions. And if both the U and the V, the northward and the eastward component, are normally distributed, most of the residual currents will sit within an ellipse, and that could be a circle or a straight line. By fitting an ellipse around some of the data, you can start to look at the you can characterize the currents by properties of the ellipse, and you can look at things like whether the ellipse spans the zero or is outside it, the width of the ellipse. And it also allows you to compare 2 different data sets. So if all of the data for a particular point fit within this ellipse, and then a different year or different ensemble member are here, you could look at the overlap compared to the overall difference, and that can quantify the difference. And you can do the same a little bit more rigorously by looking at the area under the Gaussian curves. And this is the sort of thing you look at, with the blue being the present day and the red being the future, and the points being the residual mean, and then the circle being the uncertainty around that. And in some places you see in the present day is much more certain than in the future, where it becomes much more variable. And other places the opposite is true, where it becomes more more consistent into the future, and this is in the Irish Sea. So looking at the parameters of those ellipses, you can look at the change in the variance, which tends to increase across the shelf and in places quite a lot. And this is coupled with a decrease in the mean magnitude, which make things more sort of uncertain, I guess. You can compare the ensemble overlap, which tends to decrease, and the agreement between the present day and the future for each ensemble member tends to be quite high, but lower in the northern North Sea and the south and west of Ireland. So by the end of the century, we see, so comparing these 20-year period to the first 20 years of the century, we see a 3.11 degree temperature rise with a plus or minus about a degree, and freshening of about 1 PSU. Sea surface temperature shows a preferential warming in autumn, which leads to an increased stratification, which we'll talk about in a moment. We also see a limited sea surface temperature warming to the northwest of the domain, which is linked to AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and we didn't see that during the UKCP 09 or Minerva projections. Freshening from across the shelf tends to be linked to a wider Atlantic freshening. Change in stratification. So this is the current end of century and the difference. We see a significant increase in the duration of about 3 weeks or so, and this is mainly by extending later, up to about 18 days later. This is much longer than we saw during UKCP 9, and it's as these are physical projections, we can't look at the biogeochemistry. Talking to people who work in that field, it's hard to know what impact that would have on the ecosystem, but potentially the slightly early onset by 4 days could have a larger impact than the much later breakdown. Okay, so looking at the temporal evolution, these are the regional mean time series I was talking about before, for the whole shelf and different regions for the southern, central and northern North Sea, the English Channel. The temperature increase tends to be fairly linear, which is what we saw with Minerva as well. Salinity shows a much greater freshening, and that's across the ensemble. We saw quite a large freshening with UKCP 9, but it tended to be the largest ensemble members sort of dominating everything. Here, when you're looking at the salinity, it appears to be almost like 2 linear slopes for the early part of the century, then a step change, with the timing of that and the strength of that sort of varying across the ensemble. And that could be linked to the arrival of different, of this large freshening varying across the ensemble. When comparing it to the UKCP 9 or the Minerva projections, we see a greater warming and a much greater freshening. And as I say, that's in the previous ones, it was only a couple of ensemble members that showed this step-like change, whereas we're seeing it much more across the ensemble. Because we were able to give an estimate of the present-day uncertainty with that present-day control simulation, we're able to compare the climate signal emergence from the unforced variability, which is really helpful. Most climate projections are uninitialized, and so it's better to use the end of the century compared to the present day, because you can be sure then the climate signal has emerged from the background variability. It becomes a bit more tricky if you want to look at earlier in that century, because you're not quite sure when it's dominated by the climate signal. By using these 2 data sets, we're able to calculate the time of emergence of the climate signal. And for sea surface temperature across most of the shelf, it's about 2023 compared to 2034, sorry, compared to the first 20 years with an 8-year range. Salinity is far more variable, and over much of the shelf it doesn't emerge at all. Where it does, it has a much wider range. Okay. Yeah, okay. So in conclusion, we're expecting about a 3.1 degree temperature rise according to these projections, with a range of about 1 degree and a freshening of about 1 PSU. Duration of stratification is expected to increase by about 3 weeks, initializing about 4 days early and breaking down about 19 days later. General reduction in the circulation strength on the northwest shelf, although there's a slight configuration change and strengthening in places. We talked about the time of emergence. We also discussed in the paper how you can use these data to make an estimate of warming levels at 2 and 4 degrees, and that the time of emergence helps you with this. Okay. So this is with the paper, and this is the data released, and there's lots of people helped out. So thank you, everyone. And if there's any questions.
Thanks very much, John, for a really interesting talk. I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A to see if we've got any questions coming in. While people have a bit of time to type, maybe I'll come in with a first question. You mentioned in a few examples of some notable differences between what we'd seen in the UKCP 9 equivalent projections and these ones. Yeah. And I wondered whether most of those differences are due to the driving global climate model, or whether some of them are because of the difference in the particular regional ocean model you're working with.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we've got a higher resolution shelf seas model and also a much better domain. We had to chop a corner off the domain for the previous ones. It's hard to disentangle between the two with what we've got. I did do some work trying to look at this a long time ago, but I can't remember what we found. So as well as the driving GCM, there's also the different emission scenario, which has an impact on the temperature. Yeah. So I'm not sure I found.
Fair enough. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, I'm still keeping an eye on the Q&A for any questions for Jonathan. So although I'm having problems scrolling through them at the minute, so I will go to a question that's in the chat, and hopefully I'll be able to pick up those Q&A questions in a moment. So George asks, what was the most important finding of your new analysis?
I was quite surprised by the salinity change. That was a very large change, I thought, and also by the change in stratification. That seemed to be quite significant. I found the circulation change quite interesting to the southwest of Ireland, although I've not looked at it for a while, so it's not fresh in my head. They're probably my three most interesting things, I guess. It was really great to be able to use the present-day control simulation with the projections together as well. That was really useful.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I'm a bit worried that we're not being able to, we're not capturing people's Q&As, and they may not be appearing for me. So I'm gonna ask you another question and hope that perhaps some of those might ping through in a moment. But this is obviously a really rich data set, Jonathan. There's quite, so many things that can be done with this. I wondered whether you could tell us a little bit about any of the types of impact studies that people might already be starting to think about with this new data, or what other kinds of things you hope people might start to look at with it.
So a couple of points about the data. I said we released monthly mean 2D fields. So that's surface and bed temperature and salinity and their difference, surface and bed salinity and their difference, and sea surface height. There's obviously, and this is monthly mean. Within the Met Office, we've got daily, we've got hourly, we've got 3D fields. It's just too difficult to share. But if anyone wants to work with us on that, we can collaborate. We can provide more data. I'd also, before I changed jobs, I was planning to run the standard ensemble member with the higher resolution AMM15, and then we were going to run time slices with the regional coupled model. I have ran time slices with the AMM15, and that's being looked at with this ensemble at by colleagues in Bangor, looking at flooding, coastal flooding with river flooding. Colleagues at CFAS are going to look at the data for invasive species, impact species type studies. The previous set of data were really widely used from invasive species, harmful algal blooms, different sea level studies, impact of climate change on commercial fish stocks, quite a range. So I'm hoping they'll be used in similar sort of wide range of data as well.
That's great. Thank you, Jonathan. I think it does seem like we're having some problems seeing the questions that you're putting in the Q&A. So a couple of people have put their questions in the chat. So I'll go to the first one there. But if anyone else, or can you see them, Jonathan?
So I can see a couple.
Okay.
I can see one from Paul Buckley.
Yep.
Hi, John. What do you see as the next stage of evolution of UKCP 09 marine outputs, including any tools for interrogation, future sea surface temperature that might be available to the non-academic and user communities? Next stage of evolution. So I talked about the first and second generation of climate projections. I kind of think that we need a third generation to be, because this was pretty much the same as what we did before, but just newer models. I feel we need to go to higher resolution, so eddy resolving. I think we need to include things like biogeochemistry and waves, and I think maybe maybe a coupled time slices using the coupled model. This probably needs to be more of a community affair than just Met Office led. So that's what I think for that part. I included regional mean time series because I think they might be easier to use than 3D data sets for some users. They are in NetCDF files, but you should be able to convert them to Excel sheets quite easily. And then just that would hopefully be widen up the use of the data quite a few people. In terms of tools for interrogating future sea surface temperature, I have developed for my current role a 3D interactive viewing tool for these sort of data. It's more for 3D data than 2D, but it works okay with that. That can be used with these data, which might be helpful. Where you can click on a point and get a time series and look through the data. But yeah, I guess that's so that current ellipse thing is quite a good way for working across ensembles. I think that's quite innovative. Yeah. And there was another one from Hamish Wilkinson. What do you think the driver for the increased stratification, lower salinity, high temperatures, or reducing convection? I think Carol can probably help me with this, but I understand one of the CP09 outcomes is that we expect summer to extend into the autumn, summer-like conditions to be extending later into the year, and I think that drives the salinity stratification. And I see it as temperature-driven rather than salinity-driven.
I think that's a fair, reflection of the land projections, John. I think you're best placed to talk about the impacts for salinity, but I'd agree with that. That's great.
And there's one more from Susanna.
One more.
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan. Very interesting. Thank you very much. I understand that other variables such as wind and wave strength and prevailing directions, storminess, even rainfall, and the sense that it can affect coastal areas through runoff and such, remain challenging in terms of confident projections. Is it still the case that what is the best we can do about it? Is that still the case? And what is the best we can do about it? Thank you. That's part of that question is probably again for Carol. I think what we can do about it is work with ensembles, which hopefully span the sort of range of outcomes. I think end users, it's difficult to work with ensembles, and there's a tendency or perhaps, well, it could be easy to look at just the ensemble mean, but maybe in places it's good to do your analysis on each ensemble members and see the spread of the results. And I guess there's still going to be driving conditions that are not captured by the climate models, and that's a difficult thing. Yeah. As you go to higher resolutions, you start picking up more physics that have to be parameterized. In the atmosphere, you've got in the ocean, you've got eddies at 7 kilometer, which this is. You're able to you're able to represent them, but not fully on the shelf. If we can go to the 1.5 kilometer model, you'd get a much better estimate of the eddy field. And the same sort of thing when you go to the higher resolution atmosphere. So in the next set of projections, maybe we can look at driving with higher resolution to capture those things a bit better.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thanks to all those who are participating for your questions. I'd like to just thank maybe both our speakers again, and then just a quick reminder for the next instalment of these webinars, so keep your eyes peeled for the 21st of November, when we'll hear from David Sexton, who is going to talk about the future UK winter precipitation in terms of local circulation patterns. Okay, well, I think on that, I think I'll let you all go off and have your lunch, and thanks everyone for joining today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.